Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It seems rather odd looking slightly askew at you. So, come to look then at Samuel, and we listened last week to Brother Jonathan, who I now see is in the audience with us, so it's rather nice. Considering Samuel particularly last week, and Ebenezer, and the stone of help which that represents. And we've got the consideration of Samuel in the concluding verses of chapter 7 to begin our remarks this evening. And so over the next half an hour or so, we're going to look at the sections as they broadly are presented to us in Samuel end of 7 and chapter 8. And if you have the Oxford Bible, you see the paragraph markers at various points through that, and it breaks down nicely for us in that sense. So the last few verses of chapter 7 speak about Samuel's faithfulness, and we'll consider that in some detail in a moment. As we move into chapter 8, you've got the first 5 verses which speak of Samuel's sons, how his family reacted. And the section 6 to 9 is Samuel's prayer and God's answer to him. The manner of the kingdom, verses 10 through to 18 are expressed for us. And then the concluding verses 19 to the end, the people's reaction to the situation as presented by Samuel. So we'll look at each of those sections as we pass through. So as we say, last week we're considering Samuel's faithfulness, and that's very much the last few verses, isn't it, of chapter 7. Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. And he went from year to year in circuit to Bethel and Gilgal and Mizpah, and judged Israel in all those places. And his return was to Ramah, for there was his house. And there he judged Israel, and there he built an altar unto the Lord. It is the quality of Samuel's character which comes out as we read concerning his life very often. And the comment that's made in verse 15 is that Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. And there's something oddly unique about that expression. He judged Israel all the days of his life. Just reflect for a moment on the way in which the other judges have been presented to us in the book of Judges, and indeed what is said of the kings that indeed follow on. They all judged for a specific period, didn't they? So-and-so judged 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever it might be. But the observation regarding Samuel, I think, tells us that little bit extra. He judged Israel all the days of his life. It was of long duration from the beginning to the end. We reflect also, of course, that Samuel was a Nazarite from his mother's womb, from birth. There was a life of dedication and duty which is seen worked out in Samuel's life. And my comment is dutiful to the end. That there is something unique almost about that quality of life. He judged Israel. There was a duty which he fulfilled, an obligation to his God from, as it were, day one to the very end. And presents us, of course, with that same degree of challenge, not in the sense of judging Israel, but in the sense of duty and responsibility to our God. So, all the days of his life. Now we're looking for a period here of about 300 years between Othniel as the first and Saul as the first king. There is a long period of time of the judges to be considered. And a judge is raised up when the people cry, and we'll see that a little bit later. There's a circuit of judgment which Samuel administers. He is going from place to place and establishing judgment in those places. There's a respect which the people at large have for him, and the elders in particular, again, as we'll see in a moment. And he goes into each of these places, declares judgment, considers the cases, and so on. Now, verse 1 of chapter 8 then, we are told that Samuel was old, and that he made his sons judges over Israel. He was old. We have no real idea, I don't think, unless somebody can tell me otherwise, of what age that he was. Chapter 25 and verse 1, and Samuel died, and all the Israelites were gathered together and lamented him and buried him in his house at Ramah, and David did thus and so. So again, very often you get the ages recorded of certain characters in this degree. Samuel is old and in a sense timeless. But there's an issue of leadership at stake here. We will know from our memories of Moses, of Joshua, and of the series of judges which are raised up for each period. What was required, what it seems, is a figurehead, some elders, somebody to centre their attention upon. And again, we'll see this as we progress through. Moses was an extraordinary character, a leader of his people to bring them out of Egypt. And Joshua picks up that mantle and takes them into the promised land. But when the elders that outlived Joshua had fallen off the scene, so these individual judges are raised up, but there is no longer that focal point, that central figurehead. Samuel, in a sense, is the nearest to that, covering a pretty wide area, I suspect, but nothing like the national leadership which both Moses and Joshua had done. But Samuel makes his sons judges over Israel. The names are given to us as Joel and Abijah. The meanings of the names are an interesting challenge. Yah is his God, is Joel, and Abijah, we'll perhaps recognise the Ab, father of, or father is, Yah. It could be translated worshipper of Yah also. But isn't that an interesting use of the language and the words here, Joel and Abijah? In both cases, there is a reference to Yah, the memorial name, and one can imagine the naming with confidence and anticipation by Samuel of these two boys who hopefully would walk in his ways, named with confidence, you might say. But we learn that his sons, verse 3, walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre and took bribes and perverted judgment. What a challenge this presents for us. Samuel, on the one hand, as a remarkable leader, a sincere judge, one who worshipped God and judged Israel all the days of his life. But his two sons walked not in his ways. And it's a challenge for us, isn't it, in parenting, and we look and pray for our children to follow in the right way, but it doesn't always work out in the way that one might have hoped. And there are several examples in both the Old and the New Testament of children who do not walk in the ways of their fathers. It may be a cold comfort in some ways, but it just reminds us of the challenges that face each generation, passing on the best principles and the honour of God's name, but there's no guarantee that our children will walk in that same way. The same issue was with Eli, wasn't it? His sons walked not in his ways. Eli is criticised, it's acknowledged that he failed to correct his sons as they went astray. But nonetheless, it just reminds us of how challenging it is. Verse 4, then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel unto Ramah. And it took me a moment just to reflect on this. It's the elders that come and make representation. Samuel is absolutely the recognised judge in the land and treated with great honour and respect. But there are, of course, also, as it were, local community leaders and judges in each of the cities and towns as they are scattered around. And so the elders of the towns and the villages, the community leaders, come and present their concerns and their case to Samuel. The elders perhaps makes us think of Moses and the appointments which he made, those that would help him disseminate that judgment and the honour of God's name. So the elders come, verse 5, and present their supplication to Samuel and say, behold, thou art old. Not sure that's a very complimentary thing to be doing, but there we are. And thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. They, as it were, pull no punches in their, I'll call it criticism of Samuel. They honour him, but recognise that his sons are failing to walk in thy ways. I wonder how Samuel might have reacted to that. Samuel's sons were not upholding the truth as Samuel had been preaching it, and how he no doubt had taught them. I dare say that would have smarted against him. And they say to him, now make us a king. What they were looking for. What was their expectation? They're looking for leadership, for the application of law. Were they looking for military prowess? Were they looking for a unification of the disparate tribes and the towns and the villages? There is inevitably a complexity of these relatively disparate communities, and the elders come together and say, we realise what we need is a figurehead, a leader, somebody who can take us out and take us forward. But there's an additional explanation if we turn forward a page or two to chapter 12 and reading from verse 9. So it's a sort of further extension of this business of the choosing and the appointment of the king. Verse 9 of chapter 12. And when they forgat the Lord their God, he sold them into the hand of Sisera, captain of the host of Hazor, and into the hand of the Philistines, and into the hand of the king of Moab, and they fought against them. And they cried unto the Lord and said, we have sinned, because we have forsaken the Lord, and have served Baalim and Ashtaroth. But now deliver us out of the hand of our enemies, and we will serve thee. And the Lord sent, so we're looking historically, the Lord sent Jerubbaal, and Bedam, and Jephthah, and Samuel delivered you out of the hand of your enemies on every side, and ye dwelled safe. Verse 12. And when ye saw that Nahash, the king of the children of Ammon, came against you, ye said unto me, nay, but a king shall reign over us, when the Lord your God was your king. So there's an acute military political issue at hand. Nahash, the king of the children of Ammon is coming against the children of Israel, there is a moment of crisis, and it seems to be this that crystallises their opinion. They come to Samuel, make us a king. The issue is one of military unification and battle against the king Nahash, the king of the Ammonites. So verse 6 is then the response by Samuel. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And again, what is interesting is the way in which the record is presented for us here. Samuel's reaction, having just been told that your sons do not walk in your ways, his reaction is not one of pride or indeed anger. His response is to pray to his God. Almost no reference is made by him to his sons. Perhaps we can read into that a number of different things. But again, I think it illustrates for us the quality of Samuel's character. His recourse was to his God in prayer. So verse 7, there is a response that comes from God. The Lord said unto Samuel, "Hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them." So the Lord hears and responds with this statement. God says, "Hearken unto the voice of the people." Verse 9, we see the repetition is there. Now therefore hearken unto their voice. Verse 19, nevertheless the people refused to obey. The word obey there is actually the same as the word hearken. The people refused to hearken to the voice of Samuel. Verse 21. And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he rehearsed them in the ears of the Lord. And the word heard there is the same as this word hearken or obey, exactly the same Hebrew word. And then verse 22, the Lord said unto Samuel, hearken unto their voice, and make them a king. So that hearken occurs again. God heard Samuel. Samuel heard the people, but the people refused to hear, is the message which comes through that particular sequence. And then, the second part of verse 7, we get this rather sad but powerful statement. They have not rejected thee, but they've rejected me, that I should not reign over them. In some way, perhaps in some smaller way, we've seen this before, the record of Gideon. Turn back with me to Judges 8. It's after the conquest of conquest by Gideon of the Midianites. Judges in chapter 8. Gideon is successful in his military exploits, and the people come to him. Verse 22, then the men of Israel said unto Gideon, rule thou over us, both thou and thy son, and thy son's son also, for thou hast delivered us from the hand of Midian. The idea that Gideon was so prominent in their midst as a military campaigner, Judges 8:22, and the honour and respect is such that the people say to him, we're prepared to let you begin a dynasty, royal dynasty. Your son and your son's son should rule over us. But verse 23, Gideon said unto them, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. Listen to this. the Lord shall rule over you. That was the way it should have been, that Yahweh was their God and their king that should rule in their hearts. Now it's interesting, slight diversion perhaps, 1 Samuel chapter 2, we have the wonderful words and the song of thanksgiving by Hannah, chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, and we'll just do verse 10. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken in pieces. Out of heaven shall he thunder upon them. The Lord shall judge the ends of the earth, and he shall give strength unto his king, and exalt the horn of his anointed. She refers to a king. There was no such thing in Israel. No king was there. It wasn't to be for some little while to come. Hannah's thanksgiving perhaps indicates that greater kingship which she hoped for. Perhaps we can make a link also in the way in which the kingdom should have been considered, the way in which perhaps in some ways we consider it in public address terms about the kingdom of the Lord. Turn forward to Chronicles, 1 Chronicles and chapter 28. 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 5. The way in which David speaks of the kingdom. Verse 5, 1 Chronicles 28. And of all my sons, for the Lord hath given me many sons, he hath chosen Solomon my son to sit upon the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. It was the Lord's kingdom, it was Yahweh's kingdom. And David recognised that it was the Lord's throne. And he, as it were, was in jurisdiction in that behalf. And then in chapter 29 and verse 23, the writer gives us these remarks. Then Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord as king instead of David his father, prospered, and all Israel obeyed him. It was the throne of the Lord. The Lord was to be their king. Both David and Solomon recognised that in what they did. So there's something else interesting going on here then. The elders recognised that Samuel's sons were not walking in the right way. They seemed to be calling for some higher standard, weren't they? The elders recognised that the sons were not walking the right ways. And they wanted something better, something more like Samuel, some focal point. Well, seems a reasonable question then, seems a reasonable request. Wasn't that the right way in which to be going? They seemed to recognise that Samuel represented God, and they wanted more of it. Well, surely that was okay, that was a good thing, wasn't it? But God's response to Samuel is really quite direct, it's really quite challenging. They have rejected me, says God. Turn with me to the book of Deuteronomy, because the words which we find there in Deuteronomy are as important and relevant for us now as they were to the generation that received them, and just as it was true for the community of Samuel's day. Deuteronomy in chapter 6. Reading a few verses, chapter 6 of Deuteronomy, verse 3. We know the words, the beautiful words, so very well. Hear therefore, O Israel, and observe to do it, that it may be well with thee, and that ye may increase mightily, as the Lord God of thy fathers hath promised thee, in the land that floweth with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might. These words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, shalt walk in them, talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, when thou walkest by the way, when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. This word, these commandments were to be in the heart. The elders came to Samuel and said, make us a king. But the responsibility was with themselves. And so when God says they've rejected me, there's almost an indication that they had rejected God out of their own hearts, looking for some figurehead indeed, but it would appear to me that they were looking for something of military prowess. It seems that they were failing to live by the principles which we see in Deuteronomy 6, and a condemnation of themselves. As we say, these words are just as relevant for that generation as for ours, and it presents us that very same question. Does God reign over us? Is God and his word in our hearts? And that they are individual and challenging questions. So verse 8 of Samuel speaks of idolatry, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me and served other gods, so do they also unto thee. It's a recognition that idolatry was a challenge to them. God saw that. They had turned away. Again, that same challenge is there for us, turning to any aspect which doesn't put our God at the forefront of our hearts, minds, and our lives. Maybe the challenge is there for us. It talks about bringing them up out of Egypt, and that they had served other gods so often. It's very easy, very tempting almost, to criticise that generation without sufficiently looking at ourselves. So verse 9 goes on, now therefore, says God, hearken unto their voice, howbeit, yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. Protest solemnly. The way in which the Hebrew provides emphasis is to repeat the same word, and it is equivalent to saying protest, protest. In English we use a different word as an additional modifier, but this is protest, protest. It is repeated for emphasis. And this word manner, show them the, this will be the manner of the kingdom, show them the manner of the king. It's the verdict, it's the judgment, the same word translated. It's describing what it was to be like, what the king was to be like that they would ultimately choose. But it also, I think, in the sense of this verdict or judgment, gives us the view of how history would view the choice of that king and the way in which the king would behave. Chapter 10 and verse 25. Same expression. Samuel told the people the manner of the kingdom and wrote it in a book and laid it up before the Lord. And Samuel sent all the people away, every man to his house. So the manner of the kingdom and the king is described. Back in chapter 8, verse 11, this will be the manner of the king, same word, that shall reign over you. And he will do all of these things. And it goes on to speak of the power and the grandeur, the trappings that would attract to this king. Verse 11, he says, he will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. 2nd of Samuel, chapter 15, gives us an indication of how this sort of thing might work out. Not in the life of Saul in this case, but in the life of Abijah. 2nd Samuel 15 and verse 1. 2nd Samuel 15 verse 1. And it came to pass after this that Absalom prepared him chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him, just as the indications when Samuel showed them the manner of the kingdom. This is the idea of power and grandeur, sending 50 men to run before the pomp and the ceremony of the king. And verse 12 goes on to speak of the appointment of captains over thousands and fifties and so on. Hierarchical structures which the king would put into place, creating distance between himself as the king, as the leader, and all those people down below. Hierarchical structures do exactly that. But he'd organise munitions manufacture. He would organise the chariot cities and so on. Preparations for war. This is what he would do. And he would appoint him captains over thousands, captains over fifties. Just as a side point, the word appoint there is the same as we find in verse 1 and in verse 5. Samuel was old and he made his sons judges over Israel, and the people say to him, verse 5, now make us a king, appoint. It's the same word, same idea, which is quite reasonable when you consider it, but it's just interesting to note that the same words are used in that way. And so the king would take your daughters to be confectionaries and to be cooks and to be bakers. And we're apt to think of the sweet shop with the mention of confectionaries, but in fact it's perfumeries. It's the art of the apothecary. It's the blending together of sweet spices. It's the idea of confectionaries in this case, but very much feminine versions of. Why it makes it that in that way, not sure I've necessarily worked out, but that's indeed what it is. Verse 14, what he'll do also is he will take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. The implications here, the king would dispossess them of their land, quite contrary to the obligations regarding the land that was to be in leasehold to the people. It was passed on from father to son, it was their inheritance. Here the king, and absolutely would do, take to himself lands and so on. Interesting from an English point of view, where it says he will take your fields and so on. You notice also it says in verse 13 he will take your daughters. Verse 15 he will take the tenth of your seed. Verse 17 he'll take the tenth of your sheep. Actually crops up 6 times. number of man? Perhaps so. It's only an English observation, so I'm sure we can attach that much importance to it. But he was to take the 10th, verse 15, the 10th of your seed and your vineyards, and give to his officers and to his servants. We recognise this 10th, don't we? The tithe. Crops up also in verse 17. He'll take the 10th of your sheep, and you shall be his servants. There's an extraordinary similarity in concept terms to the requirements of the Mosaic law. The tithe was taken of the people, and it was the means by which the priests and the Levites were maintained. They had no inheritance. The Lord was their inheritance. A tenth, a tithe, was taken of the people so that the priests and the Levites could be maintained in their work and obligations. So here the king is to take a tenth. Does that mean that the taxation was suddenly to be doubled from 10% to 20% against the people? Or was the Levitical system being plundered as the effect of that? Perhaps we can't really comment. So to what extent then do we see Saul's life and his actions reflected in the portrayal that we have here? Chapter 22 of 1 Samuel perhaps gives us one indication. A little bit oblique, but obviously much later on we've got Saul the king appointed, and we're in the period where conflict between Saul and he's pursuing David. Verse 6 of chapter 22, when Saul heard that David was discovered and the men that were with him, now Saul abode in Gibeah under a tree in Ramah, having his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. Verse 7, and Saul said unto his servants that stood about him, Hear now, ye Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards, and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds, and all of you have conspired against me, and so on? Isn't that an indication that Saul had done exactly as had been predicted by Samuel? Did I just say Samuel twice then? Saul was doing as the king. He was taking the fields and the vineyards and giving them to his captains and to his officers. But the declaration that Samuel makes here is for the manner of the kingdom. It would be true in principle and in general for the kings that would be appointed in succeeding generations, not just for Saul himself. This was the pattern of the kingdom that would follow. So, verse 18, and ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Remember how the record of the judges, in times of oppression and distress from the neighbouring nations, that they cry to God and he delivers them. Now here, in this place, it says, ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen, and the Lord will not hear in that day. There's almost an opportunity here to be careful what you wish for, because sure enough it comes through. You should cry out, says the end of the verse. And Exodus chapter 2 is the first occurrence of that. We'll not go there for the time. Exodus 2 and verse 23. The the choice of the people, and they cry out to God for deliverance, and in that case God hears them and delivers them from Egypt. We probably need to go to these Proverbs and chapter 1. People will cry to their God. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 24. Because I have called, and ye refused. I have stretched out my hand, and no man regarded. But ye have set at naught all my counsel, and would none of my reproof. I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your fear cometh. When your fear cometh as desolation, and your destruction cometh as a whirlwind, when distress and anguish cometh upon you, then shall they call upon me, but I will not answer. They shall seek me early, but they shall not find me. It's chilling, isn't it, in a sense, that God called out and they refused to hear, so the people in their distress would call out, and as it were, God would refuse to hear. Prophet Jeremiah gives us the same idea. Jeremiah and chapter 11 and verse 11. Jeremiah 11:11. Therefore thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will bring evil upon them, which they shall not be able to escape. And though they shall cry unto me, I will not hearken unto them. A similar thing crops up in Micah 3 and verse 4, if you would like that reference. But we see something of this event in Saul's own life. First of Samuel chapter 14. 1 Samuel 14, verse 37. And Saul asked counsel of God, Shall I go down after the Philistines? Wilt thou deliver them into the hand of Israel? But he answered him not that day. And similarly in chapter 28 and verse 6, we get broadly the similar idea. Chapter 28 and verse 6. Seeking to the witch of Endor, verse 6. When Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. So the people refused to obey. Verse 19 of chapter 8. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey. They refused to hearken to the voice of Samuel. And they said, Nay, but we will have a king over us. There's several places where it occurs, and it's indicative of the national mind. But of course, by the same degree, it's indicative of the challenge of human nature. We saw in Jeremiah the same idea. God called and they refused to hearken. Comprehensively, it's presented in Zechariah's prophecy. Zechariah and chapter 7. Reading a few verses from there. Zechariah 7 and verse 8. The word of the Lord came unto Zechariah, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, Execute true judgment, show mercy, and passions, every man to his brother. And oppress not the widow, nor the fatherless, the stranger, nor the poor. And let none of you imagine evil against his brother in your heart. But they refused to hearken, and pulled away the shoulder, and stopped their ears, that they should not hear. Yea, they made their hearts as an adamant stone, lest they should hear the law, and the words which the Lord of hosts hath sent in his spirit by the form of prophets. Therefore came a great wrath from the Lord of hosts. We see Samuel executing true judgments, but his sons were not walking in the right ways. And the challenge to the people was that they should not refuse, but should indeed hearken to the words of Samuel and the words of the Lord. So back in chapter 8 of Samuel, we begin to draw to a conclusion. What was the attitude of the people? Verse 20, that we also may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. So that fight our battles crops up, and Nahash is there in our minds. But maybe here is the challenge, that extra challenge for us, that we may also be like all the nations. Israel was different. They were God's chosen people. But maybe they didn't like it. Maybe they weren't so happy being different. That challenge of being different is there for us. Something which the psychologists call social conformity. It's a very powerful thing when we are different from our peers and our neighbours and so on. Sometimes it's been uncomfortable. Here, the nation of Israel wanted to be, as it were, like all the nations. But God was their king. God was their ruler. They had heard his law, and it should have been in their hearts. And of course, that's the same challenge for us. We've heard his law through his word. We are drawn into being too like the world, because sometimes it's uncomfortable being different. But we have to stand and be different from the people of this world and follow our God in all our ways. And so the last verse says, as it were, let it be so. It is to be in this way. And of course, Saul, as we well know, is selected in due course, and presumably the studies that you've got following will bring that together for you. And so, record of history, most certainly, in the life of Samuel. The opportunity to see into the future with the way in which the king and the kingdom would develop. But provided through this are the lessons for our life also. Yes, we look back into history. Yes, we look at the way in which God has dealt with his people. But also that challenge is there for us each day of our lives. That our God is our king. That he rules in our hearts. And that we should walk in his ways. Thank you very much.